The vibrator was Italian-made, cost $400, and had 17 settings. Cecil Beaumont James had tried all 17. She lay on her back in the center of her California king, staring at the ceiling of her penthouse like a woman who had just survived a minor disappointment, which was exactly what she had done. The silk sheets were the color of warm cream. The nightstand held a half-finished glass of Chateau Margaux, a legal brief she'd already annotated twice, and the offending device, which she'd placed back in its velvet pouch with the same resigned energy one uses to close a disappointing email. 17 settings, she said to no one. She sat up, reached for the wine. Cecil Beaumont James was 31 years old, 5'8" in flat feet, and the kind of beautiful that made opposing counsel lose their train of thought mid-sentence, which she had learned to use as a professional advantage sometime around year 2 of practice. She was a litigator at Mercer and Aldane, the most feared black woman in a room that was almost never designed for black women, and she had won cases that other attorneys had written eulogies for. She had a closet that operated as a separate tax category. She had a wine fridge that held bottles older than some of her colleagues' marriages. She had a savings portfolio that her accountant referred to with barely concealed reverence as aggressive. What Cecil Beaumont James did not have was a man, and for a very long time, she hadn't wanted one. This was the part people didn't understand, the assumption that a woman alone must be a woman waiting. Cecil had not been waiting. She had been living. She had done a solo trip to Cartagena and learned to salsa dance from a 70-year-old man named Rodrigo who wore linen and smelled like sunscreen. She had taken a cooking class in Tuscany and burned the pasta and laughed about it for a week. She had flown to Trinidad for Carnival the year she made partner, danced in a sequined costume until her feet gave out, felt the base of the steel pan in her ribcage like a second heartbeat, and called her grandmother afterward just to say, "I understand now, Grandma. I finally understand." Her grandmother, a Barbadian woman of 74 who had opinions about everything and time for nothing she didn't respect, had simply said, "Good. Now stop explaining yourself to people." Cecil had taken that advice and run with it. But the body, it turned out, did not care about personal philosophy. The body had its own schedule, its own inconvenient opinions. And lately, around 11 p.m., after the wine and the briefs and the playlist she kept titled Not Thinking About It, something in her chest went quiet in a way that wasn't peace. It was the specific quiet of a house that used to have sound in it. The quiet of something missing. She wanted to be held. She wanted someone to cook her breakfast badly and be proud of it. She wanted to laugh so hard she had to grab someone's arm. She wanted, and this was the part she admitted only to herself, in the dark with good wine, to be known. Not impressive. Not intimidating. Not formidable, which was a word a judge had used about her last Tuesday. Just known. So she downloaded the app. His profile had done something to her. She wasn't proud of it, but she was honest about it. The photo was effortless in that way that required significant effort. He was leaning against something architectural in a charcoal coat, dark hair slightly disordered, jaw like someone had taken the concept of structure personally. His bio was 3 lines. Terrible at small talk. Good at everything else. I'll cook, you bring the opinions. Looking for someone who laughs too loud. Cecil had stared at that last line for longer than she would tell anyone. She laughed too loud. Her mother had told her to modulate it since she was 7 years old. Her grandmother had told her mother to leave the child alone. It was one of the better arguments of Cecil's childhood. She matched. He messaged within the hour. And the conversation that followed was. She was a litigator, she chose words carefully, alarming in its ease. He was funny without trying. He was curious without being invasive. He asked her what she did, and when she said attorney, he didn't perform his impression of what that meant. He just said, "Do you love it?" She typed back. Violently. He'd replied, "That's the right answer." 3 weeks of conversation. Enough to feel something. Enough to say yes when he asked to meet. His name, according to his profile, was Ryu Hyun-woo. She'd looked it up. Hyun-woo, bright, shining, outstanding. Cecil Beaumont James, who had not been nervous about another human being since her bar exam, had spent 40 minutes choosing her outfit. She settled on a tailored rust-colored co-ord set, wide-leg trousers, a structured blazer with nothing under it, gold ear cuffs climbing up her left ear, heels that were architectural decisions. Her skin was deep brown and luminous, and she wore very little makeup because she had learned years ago that her face did not need assistance, only framing. She looked like a woman who had arrived somewhere important. She looked like the point. The restaurant was upscale casual, the kind of place with low lighting and a cocktail menu that had paragraphs. She gave her name, was shown to the table, saw him stand as she approached. Tall, dark. The jaw was better in person. He turned fully toward her with a smile that was beginning to form, and Cecil's entire body turned to ice. She knew that face. She knew it the way you know a scar. The way you know the specific shape of something that hurt you before you had the language for hurt. Park Seojun, no wait. That wasn't, the name surfaced from somewhere buried. Ryu Hyunwoo. But she hadn't known his first name back then. She'd only known him as Mr. Ryu, the senior associate at Kim and Yoon Partners who had supervised her internship 11 years ago, and made 6 months of her life feel like being slowly erased. The man who had handed back her research memos with single-word notes like inadequate and try again. Who had talked over her in meetings as though she were furniture that had learned to speak. Who had made her cry in a bathroom stall on a Thursday afternoon in November and then walked past her at the coffee machine the next morning without a single flicker of recognition. Cecil Beaumont James, at 20 years old, had pretended to be unbothered. Cecil Beaumont James, at 31, in rust-colored cords and architectural heels, sat down across from him, crossed her legs, picked up the cocktail menu, and smiled. Hyunwoo, she said warmly. I'm so glad we finally did this. He did not recognize her. Of course he didn't. She had been 20, unsteady, wearing the blazer she'd bought specifically to seem older. She had been learning to take up space in rooms that didn't offer it. She had not yet become the thing she was now. Cecil. He said her name like he'd been practicing it, and something in his eyes went soft in a way that would have undone a different woman. You're even more. He stopped himself, laughed. I had a whole sentence planned and you just made me forget it. Good start, she said pleasantly. She took a sip of her water. She was perfectly calm. Inside, something ancient and justified had woken up and stretched. He doesn't know, it said, in her grandmother's voice. Good, said Cecil. Let him fall. She was extraordinary at dinner. This was not performance, this was simply Cecil being Cecil, which was more than enough. She was funny in that quick, dry way that made him lean forward trying to catch it. She was opinionated without being exhausting. She talked about a case without naming names, and he listened with his chin in his hand like she was a language he was learning. She let him be charming. He was charming. This, she noted with a clinical detachment she was proud of, was the problem with men who had been given everything. They had eventually learned to use it well. Hyunwoo had grown up in the Ryu family. She'd done a quick search before the date, because Cecil did not walk into rooms unprepared. Old soul money. The kind that didn't need to announce itself because the city already knew. His family operated in spaces where law was a suggestion and loyalty was a currency, and he had grown up with that weight on his shoulders and apparently decided the answer was to become untouchable. He had practiced untouchable on her once, but that was fine. She was patient. She was a litigator. She knew how to build a case. By the end of dinner he was looking at her like she was something he'd been searching for. And Cecil smiled and let him pay the bill and stood up and said she'd had a wonderful time and watched his face do something helpless and hopeful. And she thought, Chapter 1. Outside the restaurant, the night air was cool, and the city was lit up, and Hyunwoo walked her to her car with his hands in his pockets like a man trying to behave himself. I want to see you again, he said. Not can I want to, like he'd already decided. Cecil tilted her head, looked at him for a long moment in the way she looked at witnesses who didn't yet know they'd already said too much. We'll see, she said, and she got in her car, and she drove home, and for the first time in a long time she did not feel the quiet. She felt something much better. She felt like herself. She made him wait 9 days before the second date. Not because she was playing games. Cecil had outgrown games somewhere around 26, but because she was busy, and because she wanted him slightly unsteady when he saw her again, and because there was something deeply satisfying about a man who had once dismissed her now refreshing his messages at intervals she could imagine. He texted with admirable restraint. Not desperate, but present. A link to an article about a landmark civil rights case with the note, Thought of you. A photo of a sunset that was frankly ridiculous with the caption, Seoul doesn't deserve these skies. A voice message once because apparently he'd decided to escalate where he said her name at the beginning and she had to sit down. She replied sparingly. Warmly but sparingly. Ah, Noted. That's actually interesting. Once, when he sent a joke that genuinely made her laugh. Okay, you're funny. I'll give you that. She could feel his delight through the screen. She took him to a jazz bar for the second date. It was her spot. A basement venue in a part of the city that rewarded people who paid attention, with a house band that played like they were having an argument with God, and a bartender named Dennis who knew her order before she sat down. She dressed in a deep navy slip dress with a blazer thrown over it. Gold hoops, minimal else. When Hyunwoo saw her, he forgot to speak for a moment in a way that wasn't suave. It was just honest. And Cecil filed that away with something that was not entirely unkind. You look, he started. I know, she said, and walked past him toward the bar. She heard him laugh. Good. He could laugh. The evening was excellent in the involuntary way of evenings that exceed their own intention. The band was incendiary. Hyunwoo, it turned out, knew nothing about jazz, which Cecil found genuinely funny. He sat there with his expensive watch and his good face looking slightly lost until she leaned over and said, this part is called trading fours. They're basically arguing in music right now. And he looked at her with such immediate attention it was almost startling. He asked questions. Real ones. Listened to the answers like they would be tested later. Around midnight, when the band slowed into something that had a pulse, he asked her to dance. I'm not a good dancer, he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said all night. I know, said Cecil, and stood up. She was a good dancer. Not because she trained for it, but because her grandmother had put on music in the kitchen every morning for her entire childhood and taught her that the body already knew what to do if you let it. There was something deeply Bajan in the way Cecil moved. Unhurried, certain. Like the rhythm was hers and everyone else was a guest in it. Hyunwoo, to his credit, did not pretend. He just put his hand on her waist and let her lead without calling it that. It was the most dangerous moment of the evening. His hand warm through the thin fabric. His jaw near her temple. The music asking questions. Cecil kept her face perfectly serene. Inside, she reviewed her evidence. 11 years ago, 6 months. She still had the memos, not physically, but in the specific way that humiliations preserve themselves, word for word. Inadequate. This lacks rigor. Once, in front of 3 other interns. Miss Beaumont, this is a law office, not a diversity showcase. She hadn't responded. Had smiled, in fact. Had taken the memo back to her desk and opened a new document and redone it in 2 hours and handed it back without a word. He had said, better, in the way you say it when you mean minimally acceptable. She had gone home and called her grandmother and said nothing about it, because she was 20 and didn't have the words yet, and her grandmother had said, how was your day? Baby, and Cecil had said educational, and her grandmother had laughed and said that's what they're for. He didn't remember her. She danced with him until the song ended and then stepped back and said she was tired, and he walked her out with his hand at the small of her back, barely touching, like he was asking permission from the air. Outside he said, I think I'm in trouble. Cecil looked at him. With me? She said. Yeah. She smiled. The smile she used in court when she knew the verdict before the jury did. Get some sleep, Hyunwoo, she said, and took a cab even though she'd driven, because she needed to sit in the back of something moving and breathe. Third date. Art gallery opening, his suggestion. He'd remembered she mentioned contemporary art once in passing and had gone looking for something relevant and found a show featuring a Haitian-American sculptor whose work Cecil had actually followed for years. She stood in front of a piece called Carrie. A bronze woman bent not with defeat but with intention, every muscle suggesting I chose this weight, and felt something prick behind her eyes that she refused to release. Hyunwoo stood next to her and said nothing for a long time, which was exactly right. She made this in her 60s, Cecil said eventually. Her first major show. Worth the wait, he said. And when she looked at him, he was looking at her, not the sculpture. She hated him a little for being like this. It would have been so much easier if he'd been dull. Fourth date, he cooked. She arrived at his apartment with a bottle of wine and her guard adjusted to a precise, calculated setting, and he opened the door in a plain white shirt with a dish towel over his shoulder, and the apartment smelled like garlic and something that required patience. And Cecil stood in the doorway a full second longer than necessary. You actually cooked, she said. I said I would. Men say a lot of things. He stepped aside to let her in. Come taste it and revise your opinion. The apartment was what she expected and somehow more. A certain soul money restraint, clean lines, books that were read and not arranged. A single framed photo near the kitchen she clocked immediately. Hyun-woo may be 17, uncomfortable in a suit, next to a man she recognized from Ryu family press coverage as his father. The father had his hand on Hyun-woo's shoulder in the manner of a man installing a piece of architecture. She understood something then, involuntarily, that she did not want to understand. She picked up the wine bottle and focused on finding the opener. They ate at a kitchen island with the city below them, and it was easy in a way that frightened her. He was different here, in his own space, less performed. He told her about learning to cook from his mother's housekeeper, a woman who had decided that the second Ryu son would not emerge from that house helpless, and Cecil laughed and said her grandmother had done the same thing, and he said, "Tell me about her," and that was the mistake, because Cecil talked about her grandmother for 30 minutes and he just listened with his elbows on the counter, and she forgot, for 30 minutes, to be strategic. Afterward, standing in his kitchen doing the dishes despite his protests because standing still was harder than moving, she let herself admit something small. She was enjoying this. Not the plan. Him. The specific, inconvenient, poorly timed him of him. But enjoying something and forgetting it were not the same thing. Cecil knew that better than most. She handed him the last dish. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "I feel like you're deciding something about me," he said. "Every time we're together. Like there's a verdict I don't know I'm being evaluated for." Cecil dried her hands on the dish towel. "Set it down." "I'm a litigator," she said. "I evaluate everything." "That's not what I mean." She looked at him. He looked back. The kitchen was very quiet. "What do you mean?" she said, and her voice came out more honest than she planned. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shook his head slowly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll figure it out." Cecil picked up her purse. No, she thought. You will. He figured it out on a Wednesday. She hadn't planned for Wednesday. She'd planned for a slow burn. Another 2, maybe 3 dates of exquisite warmth that she would then begin to let go cold. An increasingly impossible to reach schedule. A gradual recalibration of his certainty back to something that felt the way her certainty had felt at 20. Standing at a copy machine printing someone else's memos and being told she wasn't enough. But Hyun-woo apparently had his own schedule. He called. Not texted, called. At 8:30 on a Wednesday night while she was in sweats eating noodles out of a pot, because she'd had a 14-hour day and had zero interest in performing anything for anyone. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to not be a lawyer for 30 seconds while I do it," he said. Cecil set down the pot. "I'm always a lawyer." "I know. 30 seconds. Fine. Clock's running." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did we meet before?" "Before the app." The noodles steamed. "What makes you ask?" she said, which was a lawyer answer, and he made a sound that acknowledged this. "I was going through some old files today," he said. "I used to supervise interns at Kim and Yoon. There was a woman, I found a memo she'd written. It was exceptional, actually. I've been thinking about why I wrote inadequate on it for about 4 hours." Cecil was very still. "Her name was Cecil," he said. "Cecil Beaumont." The city hummed outside her windows. "Beaumont James," she said. "I added the James after I made partner." The silence on the other end of the phone was the loudest thing she had heard in recent memory. She could hear him doing the math. The years. The version of her he had dismissed and the version of her sitting across from him in rust-colored cohorts. She waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. "Cecil," he said finally. And her name in his mouth sounded like a different word than it had before, like "I'm sorry," said by someone who hadn't learned how yet. 30 seconds is up, she said, and hung up. He showed up at her office the next morning. This was, by any measure, bold. The lobby of Mercer and Aldane was not designed for emotional confrontations. It was designed to make people feel like their case was already lost, all marble and height and the particular silence of institutional power. Hyun-woo walked in wearing a dark coat with his hands at his sides and asked the receptionist for Cecil Beaumont James by full name. She was told. She made him wait 22 minutes, which was professional in length, personal in intention. When she came down, he was standing with his hands in his pockets, looking at a large abstract painting the firm had commissioned, and she watched him from across the lobby for a moment before he saw her. He looked like a man who had not slept. He looked like a man in the specific shape of realizing something late. She walked toward him in heels that clicked with a rhythm that her paralegal once described as the sound of approaching consequences. She was wearing a caramel-colored blazer dress, structured, severe at the shoulders, gold at the ears and wrists, and she looked like something you'd need a permit to approach. He turned when he heard her, looked at her for a long moment. "You knew the whole time," he said. "Since the moment I sat down," she confirmed. "And you," he stopped. "All of it. All the dates. You were having a lovely time," she said pleasantly. "Weren't you?" He looked like he didn't know whether to laugh or grovel, and she filed that expression for later. "I owe you an apology," he said. "And I know that's insufficient." "For which part specifically?" said Cecil. "The memos? The meeting where you told 3 other interns I was decorative? The November when I was 20 years old and working 80 hours a week trying to become something and you made me feel like the room was too good for me?" She said it without heat the way she said things in closing arguments, because heat was for witnesses and closing arguments were for facts. "Which part exactly were you apologizing for?" His jaw tightened. His eyes didn't flinch, which she gave him credit for. "All of it," he said. I was 25 and I was running from my own family's expectations by making other people feel smaller. And that is not an excuse, that's an explanation of the mechanism, and you deserved none of it." He exhaled. "You wrote the best memo I received that entire year, and I told you it was inadequate because you handed it in confident and it terrified me." Cecil looked at him. "You were terrified of a 20-year-old intern," she said. "I was terrified of you specifically," he said. "Which is at least consistent because I am also currently terrified of you, so." She stared at him for a long moment. Somewhere behind her, a junior associate was pretending to look at his phone. The receptionist had lost interest in her computer entirely. "You have a great deal of audacity," Cecil said. "Coming to my place of work to tell me you've been afraid of me for 11 years. I'm aware. I should have you escorted out." "Probably. I'm not going to. I know." She turned and walked toward the elevator. Over her shoulder, "You have 30 minutes. I have a deposition at 11. He apologized for 45 minutes and she let the deposition start late. He was not graceful about it. This was not a man who had rehearsed contrition, which somehow made it better. He sat across from her in the small conference room she commandeered and said things in the fragmented, non-linear way of someone dismantling something they'd built carefully, and she listened with her hands folded and her face composed, and somewhere around minute 20 she forgave him, quietly, in the part of herself that her grandmother had taught her was for her and not for him. She didn't tell him that yet. "I want to start over," he said. "Or not over. I don't want to erase anything, including the part where you methodically ruined me over 4 dates, which I want to be clear I think was completely fair. It wasn't entirely about revenge," she said, "because honesty was also a value." "No, no." She looked at her hands. "The first date I told myself it was. And then you made me laugh on accident and I had to revise." She looked up. "I like talking to you. I kept waiting for myself to stop." He was very still. "I know you," she said. "Not all of you, but some part of you that you've been deciding whether to show. And I think you know some part of me too." She stood. "I'm not forgiving you today. I'm telling you the door isn't closed." "What do I have to do?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just be exactly who you've been for the past 5 weeks. That's what's making this complicated." She walked out, picked up her deposition notes, walked into the conference room and proceeded to dismantle opposing counsel's case with the clean precision of someone who had just made a decision and was at complete peace with it. She called him 3 days later. Not texted. Called. Because she had decided that whatever this was going to be, it was going to be honest from here, and she was going to lead that. He picked up on the second ring. "I want to go somewhere I've never been," she said. "And I want company. Are you available Saturday?" "Yes," he said immediately, and she could hear the relief in it, the single honest syllable of a man who'd been waiting. They drove 2 hours out of the city to a stretch of coast that Hyunwoo said he'd driven past 100 times and never stopped at, and they found a trail that led down to a beach that had no business being that beautiful. And Cecil took her shoes off and walked on the sand and turned her face up and felt the sun the way she'd felt it on the beaches of her childhood, visiting her grandmother's island, the specific warmth that went all the way through. Hyunwoo walked next to her with his shoes also off because she'd looked at his feet and said shoes off or go home, and he'd obeyed without a word, which was promising. "Tell me about your family," she said. Not the file. Not the thing she'd researched. The actual version. He told her. Slowly, then not slowly. His father, who ran the Ryu operations with the specific cold precision of a man who had never learned another mode, who had looked at his sons as extensions of the family architecture rather than people. His older brother, who had accepted this. Hyun-woo, who had been terrified of disappointing a man he didn't like, which he described as the defining confusion of his 20s. The way he'd become hard at work because hardness was the only language his father spoke and he'd been practicing fluency in the wrong dialect for years. When did you stop? She asked. Stop what? Trying to speak his language. He was quiet for a moment. The water came up toward their feet and retreated. About 3 years ago, he said. After a business deal went wrong and he looked at me like I was something to be replaced rather than someone who had failed. He paused. I drove for 4 hours afterward, ended up somewhere I didn't recognize, called my mother and just talked. For a long time, he glanced at her. She's from Jeju. She used to say the sea fixes the things that rooms make worse. Your mother sounds like my grandmother, Cecil said. Tell me, he said. And there it was again, that specific attention that she had stopped being able to dismiss. So she told him about her grandmother's house in Barbados where the shutters were painted yellow and the nights smelled like frangipani and something from the kitchen that never fully translated into any recipe Cecil had ever found elsewhere. About the way her grandmother had held the history of the Caribbean in her body like a fact. The weight of it, the music of it, the absolute refusal to let it define the ceiling. We come from people who survived everything, she had told Cecil once. Act accordingly. I think about that in court sometimes, Cecil said. When I'm up against something that's supposed to beat me. Does it work? I haven't lost a case in 4 years, she said. He looked at her in that helpless way again, the one that had stopped bothering her sometime around the art gallery. Cecil, he said. I know, she said. You're going to make this very difficult for me, aren't you? I genuinely hope so, she said. He laughed. A real one, the unguarded kind. And she turned to look at the water because the laugh did something to her chest she wasn't ready to examine in daylight. The kiss happened in the car on the way back, pulled over at the side of a road for no reason either of them planned. The engine still running, Hyun-woo having reached over and turned her face toward him with a gentleness that was almost a question and then decided it was a statement. Cecil kissed him back with 11 years and 31 years and every version of herself she'd had to become to get to this particular road. And when they broke apart his forehead came down to hers and neither of them said anything because nothing in the moment needed improving. You are the most, he started. I know, she said, and he laughed, and she did too, in the too loud way she'd never apologized for. Later, much later, in his apartment, the city dark and quiet below them. She understood what all 17 settings had been missing. It wasn't technique. It wasn't even intimacy exactly. It was being known and wanting to be held by the same person at the same time, and Hyun-woo moved with the specific focus of a man who had been paying attention and intended to demonstrate it, and Cecil let herself be present in the way she'd earned, completely and without management, and it was not perfect the way performance is perfect. It was perfect the way things are when they're exactly what they were supposed to be. Afterward, she lay in the dark with her eyes open and felt the weight of his arm across her waist and thought about a 20-year-old woman in a bathroom stall who had cried quietly and then washed her face and gone back to her desk. I hope you can see this from there, she thought. I think you'd approve of the outfit, at least. In the morning, he made eggs badly and was proud of them. Cecil ate every bite.
Hello besties, in this story we learned that in a world that tells you to shrink, heal quietly and move on, becoming the most powerful version of yourself is not spite, it's survival. You don't have to announce your growth, just walk in the room. The right people will feel it, and the ones who once dismissed you, they'll spend the rest of their lives trying to catch up to someone who stopped waiting for their approval a long time ago. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like, subscribe and share.